I'm Nima Rajan. Hackers have compromised thousands of Canadian government accounts, including more than 9,000 GC Key accounts and 5,500 CRA accounts. Authorities say approximately 3,000 GC Key accounts were successfully hacked and applied for services and benefits. The revelation forced the Canada Revenue Agency to shut down its online services, but the government is hoping to reinstate online access for businesses later today. All the hacked accounts have been cancelled and an investigation is underway. Health Canada insists that it has enough ventilators on hand to deal with the possible surge in COVID-19 cases. But less than 2% of the more than 40,000 ordered last spring have been delivered. Chief Public Health Officer Dr. Theresa Tam says Canada is better prepared for a fall wave of COVID-19 than it was in the spring, but also says that wave could be big enough to overwhelm Canada's healthcare system.
It is prudent to plan and to be prepared for a reasonable worst-case scenario. This type of scenario could include a large fall peak, followed by ongoing peaks and valleys in which resource demands intermittently exceed the health and/or public health system's capacity to manage. Continuing to build up capacity across our health, public health, and laboratory systems, while urging all Canadians to continue with public health practices, will give us the best chance of keeping the epidemic on a slow burn, while preparing us in the event of a need to rapidly ramp up response measures for a possible larger resurgence.
As Canada looks to the fall and prepares for this potential second wave of COVID-19, at least 3 of the companies involved say they expect to double or even triple the number of ventilators they ship in the coming weeks. Well, meanwhile, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland says restrictions at the Canada-U.S. border are being extended by another 30 days due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The two countries will continue their mutual ban on non-essential cross-border trips until at least September 21st. The Canada-U.S. border has been closed to vacations and shopping trips since the pandemic took hold of the continent in mid-March. The agreement, which has been renewed before, was to expire next Friday. Meanwhile, members of the Conservative Party of Canada will find out on August 23rd who will guide them into the next election. Nearly 269,500 people are eligible to vote for the new party leader, about 10,000 more than the last time the party held a leadership vote in 2017. 4 names remain on the ballot: Leslyn Lewis, Erin O'Toole, Peter MacKay, and Derek Sloan. The federal government is concerned that a controversial regulatory decision last year may undermine investments in Canada's communications networks. However, Industry Minister Navdeep Bains says the government won't intervene. The CRTC decision issued August 2019 has been praised by Canada's independent service providers, but denounced by the larger communications companies. They say the rates would be far too low. Matt Stein, a chairman of a group that represents independent internet service providers, says it's bad news for consumers because rates will go up. Well, turning to New Brunswick, where residents could find out as soon as Monday if they'll be heading to the polls, despite the lingering threat of COVID-19. Premier Blaine Higgs says he is taking the weekend to decide his next move after the opposition Liberals rejected a proposal deal to keep his Tories in power through the pandemic. Turning to Toronto, where police have been handling protests over a new temporary housing program. The two groups chanted and carried signs near a Toronto hotel, which has been used as a housing facility during the COVID-19 pandemic. Protesters argue that the sudden implementation of the city's homeless housing strategy has made their community unsafe. Meantime, the counter-protesters argue that the focus should be on bolstering mental health supports and understanding their new neighbors. The housing strategy was spurred by the rapid spread of COVID-19 through the city's shelter system. In Saskatchewan, Premier Scott Moe says most of the 97 new COVID-19 cases reported in the province over the past few days are from Hutterite communities. Premier Moe also suggests that there is reason for optimism, saying that many of the Hutterite communities with earlier outbreaks are now down to almost no active cases. Last month, the Premier called on Hutterite communities to adjust their communal living lifestyle and follow public health advice to prevent the spread of the novel coronavirus. The Newfoundland and Labrador English School District will unveil its return to school plan later today. The district says the plan for students from kindergarten to grade 12 will reflect the province's guidelines for a safe return to school during the COVID-19 pandemic. It will include information to help parents and administrators prepare for classes to resume next month. The chair of the district's Board of Trustees and the district's Director of Education will make the announcement during a virtual news conference. Don't go away. President Trump's tariffs on Canadian aluminum will take effect today. We take a deeper look into how they will impact Canada's economy after the break. U.S. President Donald Trump's reimposition of a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum is now in effect. President Trump announced the tariffs on August 6th, claiming Canada is flooding the U.S. market with its raw, unprocessed aluminum. The federal government adamantly denies that. Federal officials say the reimposed tariffs will raise costs for automakers and other U.S. manufacturers that use imported aluminum on their products. Aluminum organizations on both sides of the border are condemning the move. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland already announced that Canada will impose $3.6 billion in equivalent tariffs on U.S. products in retaliation. Freeland connected the, quote, perfectly reciprocal tariffs to the exact same approach in 2018 when the federal government introduced counter tariffs in response to steel and aluminum taxes that Trump hit Canada with during NAFTA negotiations. So what do these newly imposed tariffs mean for Canada's economy, and what does it mean for future negotiations with the United States? Well, joining me now is former Industry Minister of Canada and host of Boom and Bust, Mr. Tony Clement. Mr. Clement, always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
So what do these tariffs mean for Canada and the Canadian aluminum industry?
Well, it means it's obviously tougher to export to the United States. It's basically a $7 billion market for aluminum producers in Canada. That's what the U.S. represents. So this obviously makes it tougher and more costly to export to the United States. And then the counter tariffs mean that for products in Canada that Canadians want to buy are going to be more expensive. I'm thinking of refrigerators, for instance, bicycles, and the all-important beer can will be more expensive as well. So these things hit consumers hard.
So what is the demand for aluminum beyond what Americans can produce themselves?
Well, they've got their own U.S. production is about $4 billion annually, but it's a $13 billion industry in the United States. So anybody can do that math. Obviously, Canada is a main supplier, but there are other suppliers as well. And it's very important for many industries in the U.S., including the defense industry, because obviously aluminum is a key ingredient for defense contracting. So a lot of commentators in the U.S. are saying that President Trump is cutting his nose to spite his face, but yet we still have these tariffs.
And how much does the aluminum industry contribute to Canada's economy?
It's a $13 billion industry, Nima. So this is obviously important for jobs, particularly in Quebec and in Ontario, but other provinces as well. And so I think that's why you're seeing the immediate reaction of the Canadian government to Mr. Trump's tariffs.
How will Canada make up for potential losses?
Hard to say. Depends, I guess, how long these tariffs are in effect for. Now, we are coming into the U.S. election season, of course, so that has an impact as well. Clearly, there were political calculations and considerations that President Trump made when he imposed his tariffs. Interestingly, though, the Canadian embassy in Washington has fought back on that and said, look, the two companies that have the most to gain for Trump imposing these tariffs are a Swiss trading firm and a Russian metals producer. So, 97% of the aluminum industry in America didn't want these tariffs, but the ones that did were not even sort of indigenous aluminum companies. They were overseas. But that's the politics for you, I guess.
And are there any other exports that are potentially in danger of being taxed by the U.S.?
Well, you mentioned the last time we went around the mulberry bush on this, which was 2018, before the U.S.-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement was signed. And Mr. Trump imposed tariffs on aluminum, but he also imposed tariffs on steel. So I'm sure the steel industry is waiting with bated breath to see whether he reimposes those tariffs, which again would have a huge effect on the Canadian economy.
All right, Tony, we've got about 40 seconds left. What do you think of the Canadian government's response to these tariffs? Is it strong enough?
Measured, strong enough for now. You don't want to have a whole trade war. And I'm sure we're all just waiting it out to see what happens in the U.S. presidential elections to see whether this is a long-term issue or whether it's a shorter-term issue. So I guess we'll wait and see. But in the meantime, I think they've taken the right approach. All
right. Well, Tony Clement, thank you for joining us. And we'll be sure to join you on your show, Boom and Bust, later on today. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, stay tuned. A vigil is held in Alberta for a slain red deer doctor, and the CFL discusses the fate of the upcoming 2020 season. That and more news from around the world and interactive segments right after the break, so stay tuned. A new report commissioned to look into Canada's veterans watchdog is out. The analysis by Ottawa-based management firm Goss Gilroy found that federally mandated limits on the Ombudsman's ability to investigate individual complaints posed a significant barrier to its ability to help many veterans in need. Concerns were also raised given that the office reports to the Minister of Veterans Affairs rather than Parliament. Veterans Affairs Canada says it will conduct its own assessment to determine how the office, which is currently vacant after the last ombudsman recently resigned suddenly in May, can be improved. Meanwhile, this year's Association of Municipalities of Ontario conference opened this morning with a speech from Premier Doug Ford. The event is being held entirely online due to the COVID-19 pandemic and will feature discussions and workshops about how municipalities can begin to recover from the outbreak's economic ravages. 10 provincial cabinet ministers will also participate in a forum on supporting community well-being. Vancouver police say they quickly shut down an impromptu street party that sprung up last night in violation of public health measures. Video of the party was shared on social media and appeared to show a crowd of people dancing in close quarters. A trend of outdoor parties with little regard for COVID-19 protocols has prompted some celebrities, including Ryan Reynolds, to respond to a plea for help from BC Premier John Horgan, urging young people not to party during the pandemic. Meanwhile, the town of Twillingate, Newfoundland, is this year's Kraft Hockeyville winner. The small town on an island off the province's northeastern coast won $250,000 to upgrade its arena. It also gets a chance to host a preseason NHL game. The Public Health Agency of Canada says 100 more people have become ill from salmonella linked to U.S.-grown onions. That brings the total number of confirmed cases to 339. The agency says people should not sell or consume red, white, yellow, or sweet yellow onions from Thompson International of Bakersfield, California, or any products made with these onions. Moving to Alberta, where close to 2,000 people showed up for a candlelight vigil in honor of a Red Deer, Alberta doctor who was slain earlier this week. Friends and family, flanked by medical professionals, gathered to remember and celebrate the life of Walter Reynolds.
Our community is deeply shocked, and we are in overwhelming grief. We are absolutely heartbroken at the loss of our Dr. Walter Reynolds.
Mayor Veer also admitted a sad truth, that after the sympathy cards and flowers stop arriving, the Reynolds family will be left with a devastatingly empty seat at their table. All right, well, the CFL's Board of Governors will meet today to determine the fate of the 2020 season after the league was unable to secure financial assistance from the federal government. The CFL presented Ottawa with a $30 million loan request earlier this month to stage an abbreviated season. But a source familiar with the situation says the plan fell through when the assistance couldn't be provided to the league under the terms it sought. Turning to the U.S. now, where President Donald Trump is giving the Chinese company ByteDance 90 days to divest itself of any assets used to support the popular TikTok app in the United States. President Trump's executive order Friday says there is credible evidence that ByteDance might take action that threatens to impair the national security of the United States. It remains unclear what the TikTok orders mean for the app's 100 million U.S. users. Meanwhile, Google is warning the Australian government's plans to make digital giants pay for news content threatens users' free services in Australia and could hand users' data to media organizations. The US-based company issued the warning today in an open letter to Australians, a week before public consultations close on Australian draft laws that would make both Google and Facebook pay for news that is taken from media companies. Both Google and Facebook have condemned the proposed legislation, but Rod Sims, chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which drafted the laws, says Google's letter contains misinformation. There's been mayhem in Cincinnati. Police say at least 18 people were shot and 4 killed as gunfire erupted in several places around the city overnight. In one shooting alone, 10 people were shot. Cincinnati's Assistant Police Chief Paul Newdigate says the shootings seem to be separate incidents. No suspect information was immediately available, and police don't know why the shootings occurred. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot is praising police for settling weekend protests that devolved into violent clashes. Her comments Sunday came as activists and other elected officials blasted police for aggressive tactics. Chicago Police Department Superintendent David Brown said a march started around noon Saturday and began peacefully. But he says a separate demonstration broke off, resulting in 24 arrests, 17 injured police officers, and at least 2 injured protesters. Don't go away. The Democratic National Convention starts tonight while the New Zealand elections get pushed back. More news from around the world right after the break. The Democratic National Convention begins tonight in the U.S., but there are no balloon drops or large crowds of people wearing patriotic hats. Because of the COVID-19 threat, the convention will be totally virtual. At the last Democratic convention, the party's progressive wing, led by Bernie Sanders, battled the more moderate side over contentions that Hillary Clinton had been handed the nomination. This year, it's a much more united front as the party works to defeat President Donald Trump. Meanwhile, concerns are growing that the White House is trying to disrupt U.S. Postal Service during the COVID-19 pandemic as states expand mail-in voting options for the November presidential election. The Democratic-run House is demanding that leaders of the U.S. Postal Service testify at an emergency oversight hearing next week on mail delays. A House committee wants to hear from new Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. Mr. DeJoy has acted to cut overtime for postal workers and reduce the quantity and use of mail processing equipment. The United Arab Emirates and Israel have connected lines, literally. Telephone service between the two nations began working just days after a deal was brokered to begin diplomatic relations. President Trump spoke on the new peace deal.
After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board and on a broad range of areas, including tourism, education, healthcare, trade, and security. This is a truly historic moment. Not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East.
The Emirates made the deal in exchange for Israel to drop plans to annex Palestinian territory. The United States says the UN Security Council has rejected an American resolution to indefinitely extend the UN arms embargo on Iran. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the defeat of the resolution ahead of a council meeting to reveal the vote. Russia and China strongly opposed the resolution, and America's European allies were expected to abstain. Meanwhile, officials say Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan have resumed negotiations over a giant hydroelectric dam that Ethiopia is building on the Blue Nile. Years of negotiations with a variety of mediators, including the Trump administration, have failed to produce a solution. Egypt and Sudan suspended talks with Ethiopia earlier this month. Both downstream nations have repeatedly insisted Ethiopia must not start filling the reservoir without reaching a deal first. Turning to Japan, where government data show that Japan's economy contracted at an annual rate of 27.8% in April-June as the coronavirus pandemic slammed consumption and trade. The Cabinet Office reports Japan's preliminary seasonally adjusted real GDP, the sum of a nation's goods and services, fell by 7.8% quarter-on-quarter. Japanese media reported the drop was the worst for the nation since the Second World War. Venezuelans desperate to feed their families amid the COVID-19 pandemic are risking their lives on the open seas, fishing on inner tubes with a hook and line. The fishermen face strong currents, sharks, and the fear that a fish hook could puncture their inner tube far from shore. The nationwide lockdown has paralyzed an already miserable economy and eliminated jobs in construction and restaurants. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has announced national elections will be pushed back by 4 weeks as its largest city, Auckland, deals with a new outbreak of COVID-19. Opposition parties had also been requesting a delay. Before the Auckland outbreak, New Zealand had mostly reopened after 102 days without any known community transmission of the virus. Lebanon has registered a record daily number of coronavirus infections, with 439 people contracting the virus and 6 fatalities. The country is still grappling with the aftermath of the August 4th blast that killed 180 people and wounded thousands. The explosion knocked out at least 3 hospitals in the capital and greatly increased pressure on those still operating. Nearly 8,900 people have been infected in the small country of just over 5 million. Tons of oil from a grounded Japanese ship is still spreading into waters off the Indian Ocean island nation of Mauritius. Officials say the ship has now split apart. Most of the remaining 3,000 tons of fuel have been pumped off the ship in the days since the vessel ran aground. Environmental groups warn that the damage to coral reefs and once pristine coastal areas could be irreversible. Well, forget Area 51. The U.S. Department of Defense has launched a new task force that will look into UFOs. The new Pentagon task force will investigate what military is calling unexplained aerial phenomena. Its mission is to detect, analyze, and catalog phenomena that could potentially pose a threat to national security. In a statement, the Pentagon says any aircraft incursions into its training ranges or airspace are taken seriously and are investigated, even those that are unexplained. And that'll do it for today's news. We'll see you next time.